Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're just admitting people into the webinar room. So if we can just bear with us for a couple of minutes just to make sure everybody's managed to get in before we get started. Okay, I think we'll make a start. Can I welcome everybody this afternoon to this webinar, which is our opportunity to both launch and celebrate the publication of this fantastic book, Gender-Based Violence, a Comprehensive Guide by Professor Parveen Ali and Dr. Michaela Rogers, who I'm delighted are both with us today. I'm John Devaney. I'm Professor of Social Work at the University of Edinburgh. I'm absolutely honoured and humbled to be able to sort of chair this event this afternoon. I've really enjoyed reading this book because I think it does a fantastic job at bringing together a range of diverse contributions about a wide range of topics that are all connected in relation to the issue of gender-based violence. And I think one of the many unique and really helpful aspects of the book is the way that it tries to look at the issue of gender-based violence and the similarities between different types of gender-based violence, but also recognizes how there are also unique aspects that need to be thought about, and that even within each of the individual chapters, the authors have made a really thoughtful and considerate attempt to try and draw out the importance of thinking about these issues through an intersectional lens, whether that's with regards to gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, trying to think about what this might mean for an individual within the context of a group, within the context of society. And I think one of the other things that's really impressive about the book is that sort of it looks at these issues within a global context as well as a local situation. So in terms of the webinar this afternoon, we will hear some opening remarks from both Michaela and Parveen, really talking about the motivation behind producing this volume of work, but also talking about some of the sort of challenges there are in trying to make sure that a topic is diverse and as wide as gender-based violence is done justice in that context, but also the many wonderful contributions that the book contains. Then we'll move on to having sort of presentations which are insights into 4 of the specific chapters. And I'm delighted that we're joined by the authors of those chapters today. And then we'll really open the floor to hearing comments, questions, reflections from you, the participants in the webinar today, about both the specific presentations that we've heard, but also about sort of your thoughts and reflections on the book and the contribution that the book is making, both to our understanding about these issues and also to policy and practice. So we've got an hour and a half this afternoon. We want to make sure that sort of it's an opportunity for dialogue as much as presentation. But I'm going to hand over now to Michaela to really start off the inputs today, which is really talking to us about sort of, Michaela, why did you think that this was an important thing to be engaged in?
I'm just going to pass to Parveen's going to start us off with that. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Just to add to John, if you have any questions related to people, I've just put it into the chat. If you keep on posting your questions in here, then we'll be able to have a look at the questions and answer that towards the end of the session after the presentations, if that's okay. So thank you for being here. Can I have next slide, please? So I'm just actually going to just talk a little bit about background and what motivated us to write this book. And Michaela then is going to talk about, maybe I'll also have a little bit of a process, but Michaela will talk about process and challenges that we faced doing it. Next slide, please. So I think impetus for this book and why we wanted to do it started off when I was doing my PhD, and between 2008 and 2012, at the University of Sheffield. And I struggled a lot at that time there was one chapter which I was trying to write about theoretical understanding of violence or what different classifications and everything is. And it was really, really difficult to find resources which could help you start reading about gender-based violence or domestic abuse. There was no one single place where you could it could be the university that those kind of books were not available, or it could be the internet and how advanced it is today and how advanced it was at that time. But it was really difficult to find something which is comprehensive, which helps you understand that. And that then led me writing different articles which were about theoretical approaches of abuse, which I meant that there is something available for people, and then people are able to pick and choose and read through further. And extending that, I always wanted to understand how domestic abuse happens in different countries, in different places, because you would have the same name in different ways, if you like. So, for example, if we say the treatment of widows, so in India, it's sati, where you kill women once they are killed, once their husband are dead. And in other countries, in African countries, and some of the other places, is completely, it's a similar practice, but is known slightly differently. Servitude abuse, prostitution, eve teasing, and you name it, there were so many different things. And there's no single place which talks about, or which a comprehensive overview of different forms of abuse. And I think that's where I always wanted to do it. So then I met Michaela, and we both kind of shared that kind of thing, that there's nothing like that which exists, especially in the arena of healthcare and social work. And by that time, the healthcare and social work were evolved. Up until 2012, 2015, being a nurse or being a doctor, you wouldn't see gender-based violence or domestic abuse as your problem. You would see them like in terms of the impact or the patients presenting with the symptoms, and you would treat those kind of things, but you wouldn't think that it's something to do with you. And therefore, there has been a lot of issues where records are kept, but only about the presentation of the symptoms or the injury, but not necessarily what has caused those injuries, which later on people find it difficult to defend into the court or use it for their purposes. And I think since then, past 10 years, things have evolved quite a lot. And I think we both have been talking to each other, and we shared that. And that's how we started writing and thinking about this book. And then we thought, what can we do to try and kind of make sure that it's as comprehensive as possible? We wanted to ensure that we get people from all around the world as much as we can, and we have their representation. So what we did was, this is the word cloud that we developed. It was an empty one, which we send it around to all academics and colleagues in our networks and different networks that we were part of, and asked them, can you name forms of gender-based violence such as forced marriage, karo kari, or anything like that? And this is what we got. So the bigger the wording, there are more entries into it. So initial thought was that we will have a book which will have sections on gender-based violence against men, against women, against children. But when we got the results back, we got 499 individual terms, individual examples of gender-based violence. And well, we got more than that, but 499 as individual terms, and 99% of them were against women. And I don't know why we were surprised or why we were upset, because we all know that's how it is, but it was still very upsetting, and it was still not really kind of, something that you want to listen to. And I think that's how we started then trying to bring those terms together, trying to see, okay, fine, how do we, what are the different terms which are for this particular thing, and how could you combine it, and how could we have different authors? We asked different authors who joined the team, and that's how it started. Michaela is going to give you more detail. I'm going to stop talking, but I think we talked yesterday. We have had how many authors did we say, Michaela? Individual authors who contributed to the book?
So all in all, across there's 42 chapters in the book. It was not an insignificant undertaking, I have to say. We've got 54 contributors, which is huge.
Yeah.
And I will talk a bit more about those
Yeah. So
collaborations.
54 people coming from all across the world, from various different countries, talking about various different forms of abuse. I'm not sure if we realized how big the challenge was, but it was a big challenge. There were 42 chapters from all over the world, and all of that was happening during COVID. So coordinating, writing, and all of that has been a good learning experience, a challenge in itself, and something we really enjoyed. And we hope that readers also find this book useful, and it helps them understand the extent of the problem and how the same form of violence exists in different parts of the country. Because I think it's important to bring those things together to be able to then come up with some policy responses. So I'll stop here and hand over to Michaela, and she's going to talk about what we have learned, what was the different challenges and different things that we faced that we remember now, and how the whole thing has gone. Thank you for listening, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Parveen. Sorry. Okay, so I'm going to talk about strengths and challenges because I think that they both came together. So as I said, there was 54 contributors, with people working with Parveen and I working with people across the globe. When we first set out on this endeavour, we thought, 12 months and we'll have this book. And we were looking at about 20 chapters. And as I said earlier, we ended up with 42 chapters, and the publisher kind of went, right, okay, this is going to be quite a significant edition. But what was really brilliant about this book is that it has authors from global North countries and global South countries. We've got people from all continents, apart from South America. That's the only continent that isn't represented. So in terms of working with people to pull this whole project together, the challenge was taking this book, this idea, and working with people all across the world during COVID when people were under extreme stress. But actually that was one of the beauty, and that's one of the strengths of the book, that we've got academics and practitioners who are seldom heard. You know, this book isn't written by the typical voices. We've got people who have published for the first time, as well as established academics, and that was a real benefit for us, and that's one of the strengths that we see coming from the final edition. And in that, there was a challenge, and it took 3 years to produce this book, not the 12 months that we thought we'd kind of have to take to knock it out. So again, strengths and challenges, practical challenges of working collaboratively over the internet. I think we're all pretty much experts at that now, and I think that Parveen and I certainly feel that we learned a lot from the experience of editing such a big book over this sort of 3-year period. One of the things for me that I'm really proud about is the contribution to the literature. And so I just want to talk a little bit about that before we pass on to our contributors who've, I'm really pleased that you're contributing today, and that people are not just going to hear from Parveen and I. So one of the strengths is that this book, as John said earlier, has a real breadth and diversity in terms of the content. And one of the things that we wanted to do was pull together a book that had a real range of different practices. And as I've said, we wanted to make sure that there were those seldom heard voices. And there are not just academic contributors, there are people who've got lived experience, who've written for the book, people who are deeply embedded in practice. So there's a real range of different voices. We have early career researchers, and we have established academics. So people with lots of different kinds of experience and practice. I myself, I was a practitioner in the domestic violence sector for many years before I moved to academia, and have lived experience to draw on as well. So one of the beauties is the breadth of voices and the different types of expertise that are represented in all the chapters. So in terms of the actual content itself, we were really keen to show the diversity of practices. And I think that we've managed to do that with a degree of depth as well as breadth. So we've categorised the book into these different sections where we represent some of the well-established fields in the discipline of gender-based violence, interpersonal violence. We have some of the new or under-researched and emerging topics such as trafficking and technology-facilitated abuse in its various forms, as well as those established topics such as intimate partner violence and child abuse. So we've tried to make sure that we have paid attention to some and brought up to date some of the knowledge around some of those more established forms that are more better known about, but also drawn attention to sort of the different cultural, societal changes that mean that gender-based violence isn't this static range of practices. It's actually changing all the time. We also think one of the strengths is that we have content in the book that draws attention to gender-based violence as an intimate, interpersonal, community and structural violence. So it comes across in different contexts. We wanted to highlight the diverse social and relationship contexts and draw attention to that diversity. We wanted to really draw attention to sort of the new environments in which gender-based violence takes place, to show that it's not just limited to geographical and physical contexts, that the digital and technological advances of the world really change these practices. And I think that the book really draws attention to those sort of changes in the last 10 years. We also wanted to ensure that we raised the attention to more institutional structural forms of violence. And I think that there's chapters there in terms of abuse in the workplace, in different institutions. We've got a chapter on obstetric related violence. So I think, again, we've kind of shown the real breadth of gender-based violence. Finally, I think one of the real strengths of the book is not just that we have drawn attention to seldom heard voices and highlighted under-researched and hidden practices, but the book is incredibly interdisciplinary. I struggle with that word. We have contributors from criminology, from psychotherapy, from business and management, criminology, social work, law, design, all sorts of different disciplines. And the common theme is that people have expertise, they have lived experience and knowledge around gender-based violence in all these different disciplinary contexts. So for me, those are some of the really sort of key strengths of the book. And I think that as Parveen said before, what really draws all these different chapters together is that the commonality is, despite gender-based violence affecting anybody from any community and any background, women are the more common kind of the common theme is gender inequality and the risk to women of violence in different contexts. I'm just going to end by saying one of the limitations of the book is that we couldn't fit in everything that we wanted to. And Parveen and I grappled with this on so many different occasions, but we had to stop somewhere, and we could have had twice the volume in terms of the content. And I don't think the publisher would have been very pleased, actually. I think they were happy when we said, right, this is the definitive list. But one of the things that we wanted to do was really show some of those hidden practices, and we just couldn't fit it all in. But I think we've done a good enough job for now, and it's work that we will continue to do.
That's great. Thanks, Michaela and Parveen, for helping us to sort of understand the genesis of the book, but also what have been some of the sort of challenges of putting it all together, but also the contribution that you're making. And I think, in a way, I think you're underselling what you and the contributors have done in terms of also thinking about the intellectual rigor of those contributions, whilst also retaining a practical relevance in terms of resourcing people to think through what can they do with this knowledge now about these particular issues. So I'm absolutely delighted that we have 4 of the contributors to the book who are here to talk about the chapter that they wrote and some of the key messages that they have contained within the chapter. The presentations aren't a substitute for actually reading the chapters, because the presentations are only about 10 minutes long, but please do remember that if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat, and if they're for either Parveen or Michaela or any of the four contributors, just to indicate that, so that when we come back to the question and answer session, we have a chance to sort of expand the conversation. But to start off with, I'm absolutely delighted that our first contribution is Professor Colleen Fisher from the University of Western Australia, where it must be nearly 9 o'clock at night. So Colleen, we're absolutely delighted that you've been able to join us today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentation. So I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks John, and hi to everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, in fact, if it's morning for you. As John mentioned, the chapter that I was involved in was around technology facilitated abuse, and I'd just like to acknowledge and thank my co-authors on this chapter, Michaela and Parveen, and also Lisa Fontes from the US. So really a cross continent contribution. Can I have the next slide, please, Michaela? Thank you. So what I want to do tonight really is just talk about four things, really, and recognising that our chapter really was in the context of looking at technology-facilitated abuse in the context of intimate partner violence. So I just want to talk about what it is, how it's referred to in the literature, what behaviours constitute it, and why do we write, what's the value, I guess, of a chapter related to technology-facilitated abuse, and then have a look at some of the policy practice implications. Could we move on, please, Michaela? So when we think about technology and we think about digital and we think about social media and everything like that, we're really talking about a revolution. And we're talking about also a revolution in how intimate relationships are formed, they're maintained and they're ended. And what we do know is that perpetrators of intimate partner violence are increasingly using those same technologies to exercise power and control over victim survivors and their children. And that sort of abuse really wasn't possible or available before advances in digital and other technologies were a reality and they were readily available. So in a nutshell, I guess when we're talking about technology-facilitated abuse, what we're really talking about is that abuse facilitated through digital and communications technology. When we look at the literature, there are a number of definitions in the literature around, well, what does this entail? But where we kind of landed, that sort of drew the research together, is a form of behaviour that involves the use of technology as a means to coerce, control, intimidate, stalk, or harass another person. We've called this technology facilitated abuse, but that term has actually been critiqued in the literature. And the reason for that is it's argued that when we call it that, the focus becomes on the technology rather than the abuse and the abuser. So there are a range of other labels that are used in the literature to refer to a similar thing. So we do have it known as technology facilitated coercive control. So really linking it back to the coercive control that is sort of the hallmark of violent relationships. Also digital coercive control, and there's a whole range of others as well. And we do have those written in our chapter. So we used technology facilitated abuse is the term. Now, when I sort of said there's critique about that, why did we actually choose to use that term and not another one? What we felt was that the term digital really didn't adequately account for the myriad ways or the hybrid ways that women and children experience that abuse. But it was also a pragmatic decision. What we wanted to make this chapter was available to as many people and accessible to as many people as we can. So technology facilitated abuse being the original term that was used, we thought it might be more recognised and therefore more accessible to a wider audience. So next slide, please, Michaela. Thank you. So what behaviours constitute technology facilitated abuse? Well, it really is wide range of behaviours. Some of the behaviours are overt and some of them are covert. So that makes it really complex and actually really more insidious and violence that can be experienced in the physical world. But what we do also know, and the literature points to the fact that this abuse is experienced alongside abuse in the physical world. So what are some of those behaviours? One of the most commonly reported in the literature is repeated text messaging. And this, sometimes the women and children experience just multiple messages over and over. It's about cyber stalking. And this is particularly important because in the physical world, what we do know is that stalking is a risk for sexual violence and intimate partner homicide. So particularly important there. But it's also about monitoring women's movements. So things like GPS tracking, through hidden devices on cars, on prams, on a whole range of items like that. But the perpetrators also use things like location-based features on Facebook. They use things like Find My Phone apps to track women through phones. There's also this notion of proxy stalking, which is having other people stalk the woman for the perpetrator. So that can occur through things like Facebook, where the perpetrator's friends will start stalking. There's quite a bit of harassment and impersonation on social media. One of the things that we do know is that when women are tagged on Facebook, it can be a real safety risk for them because their location can actually become apparent. But there's other things like the monitoring of emails, the unauthorised use and hacking into online banking, keystroke hardware to understand or to work out what pins are being used, monitoring of incoming and outgoing calls and texts, things like image-based sexual abuse, doxing, so improper and unauthorised use of personal information, covert and audio and video recordings, but importantly also through the children. Perpetrators can continue to abuse women through the children. Things like putting tracking devices in children's toys and things like that. It really becomes quite insidious. And there's so many more. But what we do know is that what women should not be doing is disconnecting from social media. There's three main reasons for that, and that one of them is that because of the nature of digital media, text and media objects can actually remain in space even after that woman does disconnect. Disconnecting also doesn't mean that the perpetrator will stop the abuse, and also disconnecting from technology could further isolate that woman because we operate so much in that digital world that isolation can become a real issue, plus also accessing services. So why a chapter on technology facilitated abuse? So Mikhail, if you could move one more for me, thank you. So we do know that this is one of the more recent tactics or range of tactics that is used by perpetrators of abuse. What do we know about its prevalence? Well, we don't have any population-based surveys that use a random sample and a representative sample. But we have quite a bit of information about asking questions and sending surveys to frontline professionals and people like that. And what that literature actually shows is that research, for example, from the UK found that about 45% of victim survivors had experienced technology facilitated abuse, and that was from 2014. In Australia, a nationwide survey of frontline professionals, 442 participants indicated that over 99% of those professionals had supported women who had experienced TFA. So it's really quite prevalent, and it's also seems to be on the increase. But it also has significant impact. When abuse can happen through virtual spaces, it actually broadens the scope for abuse to occur. So it's not only now abuse that occurs face-to-face, but it is something that can occur beyond those physical boundaries and physical presence. And there's research to suggest also that the impact on women and children is actually more severe than abuse perpetrated in the physical world, because basically what it does, it breaks down any barriers to that abuse continuing. Whenever you pick up any form of technology, there may be someone waiting on that other end to continue the abuse. We also do know that the impact is long-lasting. Women are constantly feeling unsafe, they're fearful, they're exhausted, they feel trapped. And what is really important is this notion of omnipresence. The women feel that they can't actually escape from that violence. We do know that there's significant emotional and physical, psychological impact. And there's also significant impact on children, things like depression, suicidal ideation, socialisation and fear. But what we also know is that evidence-based prevention or intervention is really limited, and that human services, health, legal, professional practitioners are really uncertain as to how to respond appropriately. So getting the information out about this is particularly important. So what are the implications for policy, practice and research? So could we move along, please, Michaela? So I just want to look at legal, interpersonal violence professionals and then look at some responses. So across jurisdictions, some of the tactics and behaviours that constitute TFA are criminalised in the criminal codes, but it is really jurisdictional specific. Some behaviours are in the criminal code, but many are not. And what we also do know from the literature is that abuse and breaches of things like protection orders are not treated as being as important as breaches that occur in the physical world. So they're treated somewhat differently. There's also evidence to suggest that the response that women and children receive is often dictated by the actions of individuals rather than a good formal, appropriate, systemic response. And in terms of legal also, when lots of women, when they receive a text, for example, from someone who's abusing them, there are often hidden meanings in those texts, words, meanings that only that woman knows. So convincing legal practitioners of the danger in those texts can be particularly difficult. In terms of IPV professionals, the literature really does suggest that they see it, but they really don't know what to do. So they could benefit from a lot of information around it and some practical support about how to address it. So the question becomes really, well, what is an effective response for the women and children themselves and for perpetrators? There is evidence to suggest that cybersecurity for victim survivors might be useful. And that's brought about because there's lots of evidence to suggest that those who use violence particularly might be more techno-savvy than those who are being abused. There's also really strong evidence to suggest that we need to take the needs of children into account. Supporting mothers is important, but supporting children in and of themselves is also really important. We also need to recognise that victim survivors are not just passive recipients of this type of abuse. They actually do take a lot of steps to respond and mitigate it, things like changing phone numbers, changing PINs, all the things that you would expect. But as I said before, disengaging from social media is not seen as an appropriate response. So thinking about prevention, what can we do there? Well, this type of abuse really broadens out the scope of sectors that we need to be engaging with to bring about a positive response. So thinking about those technology companies, thinking about legislation around technology and also training. So in terms of primary prevention, the focus has been on collaborating with technology companies, looking at how they design their technologies, whether that can be designed with safety and use in mind. And as I said, really broadening out that cross-sectoral collaboration. But it's really very much in its infancy. There's a lot of work that needs to be done around prevalence and about response and primary prevention. So I think I'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone.
Colleen, thank you very much. That's been a really helpful overview, both of the topic and also the chapter and the contribution that it makes within the book. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions that people have when we come back to you later on this afternoon or this evening for you. I'm happy now to move on to introduce Dr. Lucy Nelville from the University of Southampton. And Lucy, I really enjoyed reading this chapter because it's something that sort of is sometimes in the news, but actually there's not a lot of academic work around this area, and I think it's really helpful to have the contribution from you and colleagues in terms of pulling together the knowledge and understanding around this topic and trying to think through what the implications are. So I'm handing over to you now.
Thanks very much, John. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of say quickly before I began how much I enjoyed writing this chapter. It was the first piece of academic work I did when I got back off maternity leave. And Michaela and Parveen were so supportive and kind and gave such helpful feedback and such great chapter structures. It really was very easy to write, because I think the worry is when you come back off mat leave that your brain is like died a death and you have no spark anymore and you have no idea what you're doing. Imposter syndrome on acid. And yeah, Michaela and Parveen were so supportive and helpful. It was a really great project to be involved in. So yes, I'm presenting very quickly on gender and acid attacks. It's quite an interesting topic to write about with relation to gender, because certainly the general view of it amongst the general public is that acid violence is a very gender-based crime. And certainly in some countries, particularly low and middle income countries, it is. But in higher income countries like the UK, it really isn't at all. It's a crime which predominantly is perpetrated by men on other men. So there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings about how exactly acid attacks are and are not related to gender. If we go on to the next slide. So acid attacks aren't common, but because they are so emotionally laden, because of the amount of long-term physical damage that they do, the fact they disproportionately tend to target the face and the associated links with like the erosion of identity, the long-term physical pain and the emotional harm, that they're understandably extremely high profile and something which people tend to have very strong and visceral reactions to. And this means they've generally got very lots and lots of media attention, but they're not particularly well researched. Most of the research that we have on acid attacks is out of the field of sort of medicine and health and looks at the effects of these injuries on the skin and long-term effects on physical health. There's not much work that's come out of the social sciences looking at acid attacks. Partly because it's very difficult to obtain prevalence rates. They're not always recorded particularly well. They often just get recorded generically as sort of assaults or violent offences against the person, and not specifically as corrosive or acid-based attacks. And also throughout the whole world, police tend not to test when somebody has had a substance thrown at them, so they don't really know what it is. And understandably as well, people tend to react, become very distressed if something which stings you gets thrown on you. You're like, oh, it's an acid attack. Oh, I've had acid thrown at me, where sometimes it's sort of fairy liquid or lemon juice or something which, whilst obviously doesn't have a pH of 7, wouldn't really constitute a sort of serious corrosive substance. And acid attacks follow very different patterns in different countries, as I've spoken about. So, for example, in countries like Bangladesh, which is kind of an anomaly because it has such an abnormally high proportion of attacks on women by men. It's very much a gender-based crime in the traditional way that we think about gender-based violence. But in countries like the UK, it's predominantly a crime carried out by young men on other young men. And so to that extent doesn't really conform with how we tend to think about gender-based violence in the traditional sense. So what we see then in sort of high-income countries like the UK is acid not being used because of the extreme physical damage it has, the stigma that it can have when people are recovering from acid burns, the intent to disfigure and so on, but simply because it's a really useful tool in a criminal's arsenal for a variety of reasons that I'll talk about briefly later on. If we look at the next slide, please. So the general motives that the literature has uncovered for why acid-based violence happens are here: a relationship breakdown, rejections and refusal of marriage offers, and rejection of general romantic or sexual advances, robbery and street fights, racially motivated assaults and other types of hate crime, and business competition, violence against officials, and political rivalry. So we'll see really that only one of these motivations kind of fits in with this idea of acid as being involved in a gender-based violence sort of sphere. If we look at the next slide. Thank you. So in terms of why offenders choose to use acid, which a lot of this is based on a bigger project that myself and my two colleagues did for the Home Office, interviewing people who'd used acid in offences in the UK. Firstly, it's very easy to obtain. Anybody can walk into their local supermarket and buy reasonably strong bleach very cheaply. It's also then very easy to carry and conceal, and this came up a lot. So if you, for example, in the UK, if you're stopped and searched and you're carrying a knife, you're in trouble. If you're stopped and searched and you're carrying a gun, you're in serious trouble. If you're stopped and searched and you're carrying a Lucozade sport bottle, which you have decanted acid into, the police won't even check it. It will look like you're carrying a normal drink. And people who are involved in street-based violence are well aware of this. And Lucozade Sport, it's bizarre how many times it came up as the bottle of choice, because it's robust, it's very squeezy, and it's got a nozzle where you can direct the spray of what comes out of it very easily. And it's completely innocuous when it's found in your rucksack or in your pocket. Acid is very accurate compared to guns or knives, for example. And offenders often mistakenly believe they can control the level of damage. So quite often they would say, well, if I stab somebody, you know, even if I stab them what I think is a safe place, if I nick an artery or something, they might die and then I'm up for murder. Whereas I know acid's not going to kill anyone. And people also tend to believe if they water it down, they can control the pH, but they're not chemists, so that's not true. Corrosives can bring about instant visual incapacitation. So if you're carrying out a robbery or a burglary, to sort of eliminate witnesses seeing your face is very useful as a kind of side effect. Corrosives allow a physical distance to be kept between the offender and a possibly physically stronger victim, unlike other types of physical violence. And interestingly, if we look at the history of acid use, we can see that in the Victorian era, it was seen predominantly as a weapon that women would use against men, from a gender-based perspective, precisely because of this reason, that a woman could approach generally like an erstwhile lover in the street and throw acid at him, and that would present very little physical risk to her, as opposed to if she tried to sort of physically attack him. Corrosives are silent, so people don't know the attack is going on, and they tend to end crime events very quickly because people are very scared of acid attacks. Even what we would think of as hardened criminals are very anxious about being attacked with acid as opposed to other forms of physical violence they might experience. So they tend to capitulate to whatever the offender wants very quickly. If we look at the next slide, please. So in terms then of acid-based violence and gender, differences in gender depend a lot on the country where acid-based violence is happening and the motive for the attack. So as I sort of said earlier, in Bangladesh, which has an extremely high proportional number of female victims, acid attacks have been described as gender crime, and women are often targeted because they've rejected marriage proposals or some other sort of spurning of romantic or sexual advances. And here the idea is that these attacks are very much with an intention to disfigure, and that intention to disfigure and psychologically harm the victim and impact on their life going forward forever is kind of a bigger motivator than actually physical harm per se. It's that sort of really sort of sinister desire to make somebody remember this event for the rest of their lives. But this trend is reversed in Jamaica and the USA. So when we look at attacks between romantic partners or spurned romantic partners in Jamaica and the US, it actually tends to be women who use acid against former male partners. And again, often for this reason, that it is a way that a sort of physically less capable at fighting victim can attack an offender can attack a stronger victim. The next slide, please. So the highest male to female ratio of victims has been observed in the UK. So it's in the UK that we have the fewest female victims in comparison to male victims of any country, but we also are quite good at collecting and recording data-ish. So take that with a pinch of salt. But data gathered from a number of UK police forces suggests that both the victims and offenders involved in acid attacks are much more likely to be male, with men constituting 72% of the victims of corrosive-based crimes and 88% of the offenders. There isn't sort of much work about this through a critical gender lens. So when I've tried to critique some of the perspectives on this, I've generally sort of had to look at people writing editorials and feminist think pieces. So there was a really interesting editorial by Rabina Khan in The Independent, where she spoke about the prominence that acid attacks in the UK rose to prior to lockdown. The government seems to have lost a lot of interest in them again now. They've dropped off the radar. And she writes this, she says, when we thought they mostly affected Asian women with jealous exes, acid attacks weren't on anyone's radar. It's only because we're all vulnerable that we're starting to address the issue. And I think that's really interesting in terms of the insight that shows on how the UK has been responding to acid attacks. And I really think there's scope here for some really interesting research to be done around policy responses to acid attacks and how that intersects with ethnicity, race, gender, class, and so on. If we look at the next slide. So yeah, finally, what can we do to help reduce corrosive crime? So a big thing that we can do is try to control how accessible corrosives, particularly strong corrosives and strong acid and alkalis, are. So a number of countries, Cambodia, Pakistan, have introduced much stricter licensing to try and make it much more difficult for ordinary people to get hold of particularly concentrated corrosives. There's also often been calls for there to be a sort of register that's kept. So if you buy strong acid or alkali, you have to show ID, and the shop should keep a record of that. But legislation like that can be harder to push through. Also, perhaps thinking about making Lucozade sport bottles change colour if they come into contact with things with a particularly low or high pH, because it's those sorts of bottles which are making this weapon so easy for people to carry when they're sort of walking around on the streets and so on. Obviously, deterring potential throwers through corrosive acid law. As a criminologist, I'm not always a big fan of using strong laws as deterrents because the evidence of whether or not that works is patchy. But certainly you could say that the tightening of the legislation around carrying a knife has had some sort of impact on knife crime. So perhaps we need to think about deterrence that way in terms of carrying acids and alkalis. Focusing on individual carriers and throwers. So this idea of making individuals less receptive to carrying and using corrosives or weapons. So sort of similar to the pulling levers approach, a kind of broader holistic view of violent crime as a health problem, looking at education in schools, working with young people, general kind of pro-social schemes that help to deter young people from becoming involved in violence and crime more generally. And finally, focusing on communities, so interventions aimed at communities where the prevalence of carrying and use is high. So in low and middle income countries where acid-based crime is very much something which is done to women by men, looking at how that links with ideas around toxic masculinity and punishing womanhood that doesn't conform to expectations and education around that. And somewhere like the UK, perhaps having health warnings on packaging like we do on cigarettes. So when we look at when acid is used in domestic violence situations in the UK, quite often it seems quite spontaneous. People will be having an argument at home, even often in the kitchen, and they will open the cupboard and get out a bottle of like dark deep action gel and dump it over their partner. And quite often they're horrified by the effects that can have on somebody. So they didn't understand that actually that the physical damage could be that strong. So perhaps, you know, having these pictures that warn of the level of damage that acid and alkali can have when it's thrown particularly into the face. So yeah, I think that sums it up for me. Bit of a whistle-stop tour. I hope that was helpful. And again, yeah, thank you very much to Michaela and Parveen for all your work with this book.
Lucy, thank you very much. I've certainly learned a lot just from that short presentation about sort of both the issue itself, but also what might be some of the policy and practice responses that could be helpful in this area. So thank you very much for that. Moving on and picking up on the theme that Michaela mentioned earlier on, that one of the really lovely features of the book is that it's at people at the different stages of their academic career. I'm really pleased to welcome soon to be Dr. Sally Sutherland from the University of Brighton. And Sally's going to be talking about an issue that I know some colleagues and friends of mine have experience of around sexual harassment, and looking at the issue of breastfeeding as just another way in which women are policed around their body and their behaviours. So Sally, delighted that sort of you've chosen to explore this issue and to join us today.
Thanks, John. I don't know if I'm quite yet nearly doctor, but I'm hoping it'll happen at some point. But thanks for that generous introduction. So yeah, my name's Sally Sutherland. I'm the author of the chapter Sexual Harassment, Breastfeeding, Design and the City. And kind of going back to what Parveen was saying earlier in the introduction, I think when I saw the call for these chapters, I was really excited to think, well, you know, this is something I could contribute to. Design and gender-based violence isn't talked about very often at all, but I think there's so much there, and it's almost, I think there've been some themes that have come up in the last two presentations that have almost kind of lended themselves to design exploration as well. So for me, I really think, you know, what is my role? What role has my discipline got to play in gender-based violence, and what does that mean? And so writing this chapter as a design researcher has been such a privilege. So thanks so much to Michaela and Parveen, because I know how much work they've put into this book, and I'm very privileged to be part of it. So thanks. So my chapter is in part 4, in non-partner sexual violence, and it's probably a good example of a chapter that talks about violence beyond the individual. And yeah, do you want to go to the next slide, please? So before I kind of start, just a note about gender and language. Something that I include within the chapter is this. One thing that is really important to clarify is that is language. And as a researcher working on a subject that relates directly to biological sex differences and gendered norms and expectations, language is a really important thing to navigate. And in my chapter, I recognise the limitations of binary definitions of gender in discussions about breastfeeding and street harassment. So within the chapter, ideally, the terms will be inclusive of all gender identities and people, but the current dominant language and binary understandings of gender in research have made it really problematic. So I really hope that we can expand research to do with breastfeeding and street harassment and sexual harassment to really make sure we're including people who use different terms for breastfeeding, such as chest feeding, and experience the world with different gender identities, because there's a real lack of knowledge and understanding about those experiences. So within my presentation and the chapter, when I talk about breastfeeding, I'm also including chest feeding as well. And so that's just a little nod to gender-based language. Next slide, please. So this chapter references experiences in the UK, and I'm situated in the UK. I've always lived in the UK, but some of the ideas may be transferable to other places. I know there's a question in the chat about whether or not the book has data and examples of low and middle income countries. And I'm sure we'll kind of get on to explain that later, but I think it is really important to situate this and also situate it within the context of design. I'm offering a design lens to the subject. So as many people know, sexual harassment in public spaces in the UK is a widespread problem, and it affects people of all genders, but disproportionately women and girls. And the behaviour is preventable. The behaviour is often violent and reflects a hostile attitude towards women. It violates people's rights, freedoms and dignity. And And it makes navigating public spaces difficult, especially for women, girls, and those with other intersecting marginalised identities. So many women, including mothers and pregnant people, will have likely experienced street harassment. And these experiences shape how people feel about how they move through public spaces. So the fear of encountering harassment limits girls and young women's access to education, so like commuting to and from school, and it also restricts engagement in other health-related activities and practices like exercise and leisure. So what I do in my chapter is I use breastfeeding as an example of how public harassment negatively impacts different, often health-promoting practices. And breastfeeding is one of the many activities affected by this often hostile atmosphere within public spaces, and that can have really significant consequences. Next slide, please. Thanks. So it's well established that breastfeeding is beneficial to mothers, parents and infants and communities. Despite the benefits, the UK has one of the lowest breastfeeding rates in the world, and in Western countries, rates are very low, and that's for lots of reasons. That we do really need more research on that, but there's lots of social and cultural barriers that we know of to breastfeeding outside of the home. This is a picture of a woman that I've done some work with, Jasmine. She's happy for me to use this in this presentation. I spoke to her this morning, and she's a student at UAL, and she really encounters difficulties even within higher education institutions as a student, to where she can breastfeed, what that means. So it's something that affects people throughout our throughout the world, throughout the UK, and also within academia, within our universities as well. So there's limited research about how neighbourhood violence, including street and sexual harassment, might affect parents' experiences of breastfeeding. And as a designer, I really believe strongly that reimagining and redesigning the public realm offers opportunities for positive change. But it's really important to recognise that design also plays a role in harassment and violence. So what I mean by that is the public domain where breastfeeding occurs is shaped by design decisions, cultures and actions. But I also believe that creative practices can lead to safer and more equitable caregiving environments. And do you want to go on to the next slide? So we know that emotional discomfort impacts breastfeeding, and strategies like using covers or avoiding eye contact are discussed in the chapter. Often a way to kind of respond to making sure people can feel comfortable within the public realm or outside their homes to breastfeed is to put in nursing rooms in public spaces, but they really have limitations, and I discuss this in the chapter. It's often very mothering, and it's interesting when you actually look at how people try and negotiate breastfeeding within the public realm, and how similar that is to how people navigate the public realm because of street harassment. People avoid eye contact, they choose specific routes, they go to certain places, not to other places, and it really shapes how people experience the public realm. So there's strategies to avoid the harassment really resemble those used by parents. And design solutions focusing on individual safety aren't enough. As I said, and I talk about in the chapter, they often other people, and broader cultural and societal challenges need addressing and radically reimagining if we're going to work towards more inclusive, safe spaces. Next slide, please. So within the chapter, I introduce a project by Eliza Hatch, who has a project called Cheer Up Love, which is a creative approach which kind of counters the conventional solutionistic problem-solving idea of responding to street harassment. And the project uses photography. It's an online platform there's community events, podcasts, exhibitions, talks and workshops that so it kind of spans that physical and digital. And survivors share their stories of harassment and are photographed within the location where it happened. And the project reclaims public spaces and bodies. Those photographs are then posted on Instagram and they're exhibited. And as a project, it really aims to generate empowerment and action against harassment. If you look at the examples of the project, of the experiences on the Cheer Up Love website and the project more generally, it really highlights maternal and postnatal harassment and the hypersexualization of nipples and breasts and mothers and people who've had children or may go on to have children. And it really showcases these individual experiences, and it aims to enable people to talk about and think about alternative futures. So next slide, please. I used 3 photo examples within the chapter. One is Koratima. Another one, could you go to the next slide, is Asiya. And another one, the next slide, please, thanks, is Kelsey. And hopefully you'll have a look at my lovely chapter and you'll be able to read these in a bit more detail. But these stories are examples of the really pervasive nature of street harassment. And as responses, the work by Eliza Hatch become kind of agentic objects, which are about shifting narratives about bodies and agency. So the platform, it doesn't dictate solutions, but it invites thinking, conversations and actions. And these stories challenge norms, myths and misrepresentations, and they really promote change. So it's really an example as a project of how creative practice and creative practitioners can, shift power and promote change and channel norms and go beyond these ideas of raising awareness and aim for more radical and lasting change. And yeah, do you want to go to the next slide? Thanks. So I guess just summing up, in the UK, the public realm is a site of frequent harassment for many girls, women, mothers, people and parents. And it's something that is gaining more attention now within kind of cultural discourses. And we do know that action and change are needed to reflect this situation. It's really important that we take an intersectional approach in understanding unique experiences of violence and their consequences on infant feeding practices. So listening to these stories and understanding and contextualizing them and situating them is a really important part of what we need to do. And it's something that as a creative practitioner, this is the world that we work within. And I think it's just it's just quite a great example as well of a project that spans the digital and the physical. So as our digital and physical world are kind of overlapping more and more, it's a really good example of a project that does that. So challenges of public sexual harassment and public breastfeeding really originate with levels of violence beyond the individual, meaning that individualistic solutions often act as sticking plasters. And I really hope this chapter really adds something else to the book about how creative practice can engage in challenging the normative narratives and shift power and dismantle myths and maybe disrupt some invisible norms. Next slide, please. Thanks to Eliza Hatch for letting me use the photos, and to Koratima, Asiya, Kelsey for permitting the pictures and the stories to be shared within this context. And last slide. But I think we'll probably have questions at the end.
That's really great, Sally. Thank you for what's been a really interesting presentation. It's got me thinking about lots of things. I was part of a working group last year with Scottish Government around misogyny, and there was a lot about street harassment. And actually, we didn't have very many representations from women and girls about harassment around breastfeeding. I'm now sort of wondering why that was. So you've sparked a lot of thinking in my mind about sort of legislation, which we're hoping will come through the Scottish Parliament in the near future. We're now moving on to our fourth presentation, and maybe last but by no means least. So I'm really pleased to welcome Professor Emma Tomlin from the University of Leeds, who's going to be speaking about spiritual abuse and gender-based violence. So Emma, very happy to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, John, and also to Michaela and Parveen for including me in this volume. Before I wrote this chapter, I hadn't specifically written anything on spiritual abuse and gender-based violence. So it was a really good opportunity for me to see what had been written and how it related to other things that I've worked on in the past. So in my chapter, I explored the phenomenon of spiritual abuse in 3 terrains. So in faith settings, in the family, and also in the wider public sphere. And I argue that since it's mostly perpetuated by men taking advantage of the patriarchy and heteronormativity of religious traditions to suit their interests, that spiritual abuse is largely identical to gender-based violence. So in the short time that I have, I want to first make some comments about the use of the term spiritual abuse, and then I'll follow that with a presentation of some examples of different manifestations in these 3 domains of faith settings, the family, and the wider public sphere. And overall, I'm going to conclude that although the term spiritual abuse is viewed by some as controversial and potentially damaging, in the way that it might reinforce racial and cultural bias, that without such a category, without such a label, some forms of abuse might be missed, and therefore specialist strategies and solutions to deal with them are overlooked. Can I have the next slide, or can I change? Oh, right, okay, excellent, thank you. So I'm going to look at debates about the use of this term, spiritual abuse. In the literature, it's often used interchangeably with religious abuse, and increasingly attracts the interest of scholars, faith actors, and organisations. And in fact, there's been quite a striking upsurge in discussion about it over the past few years. And I strongly suspect that the Me Too movement has played a crucial role in validating the experiences of survivors and pushing for social change to prevent and address abuse in all its forms, including within religious and spiritual contexts, but also the increasingly wide use of social media is an important platform where women and men can share their stories and publicise cases. Can I have the next slide, please? So what is it? What is spiritual abuse? So Swindle suggests that there are 3 broad types. So first of all, abuse perpetrated by religious leadership, typically an individual leader. Secondly, abuse perpetrated by a religious group directed either towards an individual or towards a group of people. And thirdly, abuse in which the abuse itself actually has a religious component to it. Next slide, please. Despite this, it's not a term that's widely used yet in social work or in legislative frameworks. And while some argue strongly for it to be more recognised as a distinctive form of gender-based violence, others are much more cautious, as I said, for it potentially reinforcing racial and cultural bias, in the sense that there could be a danger that the term spiritual abuse might be used by those who are hostile to particular spiritual practices and traditions. So for instance, on the slide here, there's a quotation from the Evangelical Alliance, who have argued against using the term because of its own inherent ambiguity, and also because attempts by some to embed it within statutory safeguarding discourse and secular law would be unworkable in practice, but also potentially because it can be discriminatory towards religious communities and damaging to interfaith relations. There are others, however, who consider that it's problematic that it's not formally recognised by third sector and statutory bodies in the UK, but also internationally. They argue that it's a distinctive form of abuse that has very particular attributes that may require special types of knowledge and strategies. So for instance, it provides a framework for addressing abuse in a way that acknowledges its unique characteristics and consequences. So it gives sort of clarity and recognition to the form of abuse that's been experienced. It validates particular experiences. It serves to hold abusers accountable. To use the term can play an important role in prevention and in healing. And also to recognize something like spiritual abuse can also be important in terms of ethical and pastoral guidance, both for survivors, but also for perpetrators. And another area of debate in terms of how we use the term, or whether we should use the term, is in terms of the kinds of activities that people include within it. So for instance, some confine it to its emotional and psychological dimensions, whereas others also emphasize that we need to consider physical and sexual aspects. And additionally, if spiritual refers to the space within which it takes place, so for instance, a faith setting, such as a place of worship, then this leaves out forms of abuse that leverage religion and spirituality, for instance, in the home and in wider society, including the workplace. So I'm arguing that we need a broader perspective to look at the kinds of settings within which spiritual or religious abuse takes place. So I'm now going to say something about the three different settings, about faith settings, the family, and also wider public settings, while of course recognizing that these areas are not clearly demarcated. So spiritual abuse within faith settings. So within this category, I would include the following. So instances where scripture or beliefs are used to humiliate or embarrass devotees or religious followers, where there might be coercion to give money or other resources to religious institutions or to faith leaders, where force is used to be intimate or to coerce individuals to engage in sexual activity, and where there's pressure or obligation to do things against one's will. And many of the first-hand survivor accounts of spiritual abuse relate to faith settings where the trust that's placed in faith leaders, of course, it can bring many positive outcomes, but where the power imbalance is abused or where the views and advice of faith leaders are ill-informed, the consequences can be disastrous. So for instance, next slide, please. This includes examples of spiritual abuse that have led to mass violence. Over recent years, there have been a number of important books published looking at abuse scandals within Tibetan Buddhism and yoga traditions. The abuse of LGBTQI+ people in faith settings where their sexuality is somehow seen as wrong or immoral, and they might be subject to dangerous forms of conversion therapy. The sexual and physical abuse of children, there are many examples of this within faith settings, and also witchcraft or juju rituals that are found within some particularly African communities. Next slide, please. So the second category I want to look at is spiritual abuse in the family. And here I would include examples where religious beliefs or practices of family members might be ridiculed, where people are prevented from the free practice of their religious traditions, where beliefs might be used to manipulate or bully family members, where it's demanded that children might be raised with or without a certain religion, and where religious texts or beliefs are used to justify other kinds of abuse, so for instance, physical, sexual, or financial, etc. So this could include, for example, next slide, please, the use of religious texts, teachings, theologies to justify the abuse of a partner or of children, the use of religion as a form of emotional abuse, and also forced marriage. Next slide, please. So the final category that I want to look at is spiritual abuse within the public sphere. And I think we probably think about this less often than we think about it within the family or within within faith settings. And I think this is also much more difficult to control and legislate against as well, because often these are pervasive forms of bias even that can often go unnoticed and unchallenged, but nonetheless, it's potentially helpful to label them as spiritual abuse. So examples of this might be where this, oh no, go back again, sorry. I just wanted to go on over this slide. So this could include, for example, where the state discriminates against people because of their religion. So for instance, using threats of or actual violence, where public or private institutions, so schools, prisons or workplaces might discriminate against people because of their religion. And finally, where individual perpetrators might use faith to coerce people to engage in activities they would otherwise not have participated in. So the next slide for some more specific examples. So for instance, we might include laws banning or forcing Muslim women to either wear the veil or not wear the veil in public, spiritual abuse within public and private institutions, including schools, prisons and workplaces, where equalities and human rights legislation are often ineffective or poorly understood, and where individual perpetrators might use faith to coerce people to engage in activities. So for instance, human traffickers using religion as a tool of coercion through spiritual abuse. Okay, so I'm just going to summarize now. I don't have another slide. So just to summarize, spiritual abuse occurs within faith settings, as well as the family and wider public sphere. I argue that it's identical to gender-based violence because it's mostly perpetuated by men taking advantage of the patriarchy and heteronormativity of religious traditions to suit their interests. The term spiritual abuse is viewed by some as controversial and as potentially damaging, and that to single out some forms in this way, some forms of gender-based violence in this way, could risk reinforcing racial and cultural bias. At the same time, others strongly argue that without such a category, some forms of abuse might be missed and therefore specialist strategies and solutions to deal with them overlooked. And finally, in adopting this label, practitioners need to be reflexive and cautious, but that naming some forms of abuse as spiritual or religious is a helpful strategy that will promote a wider consideration of the context for abuse that leads to gender-based violence. This will increase the understanding of the motivations and the means of perpetrators, as well as how abuse is experienced and challenged from the perspective of survivors. That's it. Thank you very much for listening.
That's great, Emma. Thanks. That's really interesting. I like the way that you were able to talk about the sort of individual behaviours that might lead to spiritual abuse, but placing this very squarely within much more structural ways that society operates, and drawing out sort of what might be the oppression of religious minorities versus the gendered nature of that as well. Yep, so that's been really helpful. Colleagues, thank you very much for all the thought you've put into the presentations this afternoon. We've some time for either questions that participants in the webinar today might want to ask, and also any comments or reflections that people have. I suppose to kick off with the question that's in the chat already, more of a general question. Does the book have data and examples from low and middle income countries, or is it more tilted towards high income countries? I don't know whether, Michaela, you want to come in on behalf of you and Parveen?
Yeah, for sure. No, there's a real diversity of settings and of practices. So just to give you a few examples of chapters that speak to practices that are not in high income countries, there's chapters on widowhood related abuse, bride abduction, dowry related abuse, wartime violence, divorce related abuse. There's a chapter on the legislative framework in South Asian countries, and there's another chapter on the international legal framework. So we've very much been mindful about not just representing practices or communities within high income countries. So I think we've managed that balance in the book. It is difficult because we're both, Parveen and I, are based at University of Sheffield in the UK, so a lot of our contacts and networks are UK based. But I think we did a lot of work at the start If you're in the presentation at the beginning and Parveen showed you a word cloud, the activity there that we did was kind of global. It was international. We had contributors, about 500 contributors from across the world. And then we used that as a way to try to recruit contributors. So we think we've got balance, and it is fairly representative and fairly international in its scope. I think John spoke about that earlier as well.
That's great, Michaela. Yeah, and I think it's one of the important contributions that the book makes is starting to open up a global conversation. We've still a long way to go, but actually I think this book takes a bigger step than many other have done, where it tends to be sort of focusing on both contributors from the global north and from particular countries within the global north, and also on issues which are very specific to those countries. Yeah, but it's good that sort of we're now actively trying to sort of redress that. Any other comments anybody would like to come in with? I'm conscious no other questions there. Colleen?
Yeah, can I just add about the question about low and middle income countries? The work around technology facilitated abuse is really very much based in basically 3 countries: Australia, the UK, largely in North America. So I would really encourage, we really do need research from the global south and low and middle income countries to really look at it in that context, because it's absolutely missing at the moment.
Can I just add to that? Because a colleague, Sheikh, who's in this session, actually, he and I have published a scoping review on technology facilitated sexual violence in low and middle income countries. It was just published online yesterday in Trauma, Violence and Abuse. So please do access it, everybody. And well done, Sheikh, for a brilliant article.
Yeah, and it's good to see more of that work, and I think sort of there's an onus on many of us who are involved in journals or with publishers advising on books to make sure that sort of that work gets accepted and it reaches a broad audience, because I think that's the other part of the challenge here. It's not just producing it, it's making sure that it can be sort of promoted. Any other questions that anybody would like to ask any of our contributors today, or general reflections about sort of the sorts of challenges around gender-based violence that you might be sort of engaged with in your work or your own research? I'm conscious that we've probably got people who are coming from practice backgrounds as well as those who are sort of involved in academia. When people are maybe thinking about that, I suppose I wanted to sort of start to maybe try and tie together some of the presentations. We don't have much time, but maybe sort of ask the contributors from the individual chapters about, in terms of locating your work within the broader conversations that were taking place within the book. Do you think there are particular policy or practice implications for how we think about gender-based violence and should respond? It's a big question, so I'm not expecting you to sort of be able to solve the problem, but it's trying to get a sense from either of our chapter contributors about where you think your work sits alongside some of the policy or practice developments, either within your own national context or internationally. Would anybody like to kick off?
I'll have a shot at it. I think one of the things where TFA really adds an extra dimension, if you like, is around the we know that we need intersectoral, cross-sectional, multi-sectoral responses to these issues. And one thing that TFA does, it actually brings in another sector that we need to be really engaged with, and that's the tech sector, which we haven't really been, all that aware of and alert to previously. So I think that extends, the number of sectors that actually need to be able to come together to address this issue holistically.
That's really helpful, Colleen, and the fact that sort of some of these issues don't have straightforward boundaries. And I was thinking of that, Emma, in relation to your own work, that we sometimes have religious orders or bodies which may have headquarters in one country, but they have followers, and they may have sort of a network that sort of extends beyond national borders. And so there seems to be something as well about sort of how we think about the issue of spiritual abuse and the role of institutions transnationally, not just within a specific location?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important point, that many religious organizations are distributed in different kind of cultural and religious settings. But in terms of the issues that women face in the UK, for instance, it's often due to cultural and religious traditions that are from their homeland, from their traditional religions, particularly, say, women who have been trafficked, for instance. And I don't think in the third sector and statutory world there's yet enough recognition or even research. I mean, there's really not very much research on this. For instance, the way that traffickers use spirituality to coerce people into trafficked situations. There's very, very scarce literature on this. So, not much that the third sector and legislators can draw upon anyway to, to support taking a firmer stance and actually using this label of spiritual abuse. So I think there's still a big lack of understanding about the way in which religion and spirituality shapes not just gender inequality broadly, but specifically gender-based violence.
That's very helpful. Thanks, Emma. I'll maybe sort of bring in Lucy and Sally on a slightly different topic. I was struck by the fact that sort of for both of you were sort of talking about that delicate balance between, on the one hand, using legislation to drive behavioural change versus more public health approaches, which are about education and increasing public understanding. So I wonder if the two of you might like to sort of just talk a bit about about trying to find that sweet spot, the balance between those two things. Lucy, would you maybe like to come in first?
Sure. Yeah, I think. I think obviously it's a difficult balance. I think tightening some of the legislation around acid, which the UK is now doing, like you now have to be over 18 to purchase any form of acid and alcohol. I'm not sure how vigorously that's policed in supermarkets, but nominally you now have to be over the age of 18. So I think things like that do help. But at the same time, I think nearly everything that's come out of the whole field of criminology suggests that the public health model and kind of broader societal interventions are generally more successful than just straight up kind of punitive deterrence, particularly in a country like the UK, for example. But certainly how easy it has historically been to procure strong acid and alkali, and how cheap it is to get hold of even industrial strength stuff, it is a problem. Compared to, like, for example, getting hold of a gun in the UK is not only difficult, but it's expensive. So I think there needs to be some sort of balance of tightening up legislation around it, and making people realise that actually if they're caught carrying acid, there will be consequences, because a lot of people think even if the police were able to identify what it was, they wouldn't be in trouble, because there's not very clear communication about what the law is and what punishments, what sanctions would be faced for it. But generally, as a peace and love hippie criminologist, I'm always going to advocate for education and more money being put into social care, and let's restart Sure Start over lock it up and throw away the key. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the matter.
Right, so always love a good shout out for Sure Start. Sally, talking from legislation, probably from a different perspective there, which is thinking about sort of legislation which is putting duties on others, such as employers and local authorities, about provision, but how much is it also about something which is about winning hearts and minds?
Yeah, I think we've, especially within the subject of breastfeeding, we've gone way beyond the kind of raising awareness. We know that if you look at the research available on it, the majority of mothers and birthing people want to breastfeed, but actually stop before they want to, and that creates all kinds of feelings of shame and guilt and even trauma for people, regardless of how they feed their children. And moving away from that individual choice model and raising awareness is really important. And for me as a designer and a design researcher, what I'm interested in is how design plays a role in those systems and structures that surround practices that either enable or you know, not in a creepy way, kind of behavior changey way. I think there's a bit of a problem with creepy behavior change design stuff, but I think there's a real look, you know, looking at this chapter among the others has made me realize how what the overlaps are, and how in design we're not researching, there's not enough women, there's not enough people talking about gender-based violence in design, and there's lots of reasons for that, but that's a whole other book webinar. And so yeah, I guess it's given me the motivation and the recognition that I'm like, okay, I'm onto something really important here. And I think within my discipline, there's so much to be done that can really inform policy and practice, but I think that comes from working together. So yeah, I'm just pleased that we've got design in here, so thanks.
Great, and thank you for your contribution as well. Listen, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to sort of start to pull all this together now, and I'm going to hand over to Michaela for a few closing words on behalf of herself and Parveen. I think Parveen's had to sort of nip off to deal with a family issue. So Michaela, over to you before I say goodbye to everyone.
Yeah, thank you, John, and thank you, John, for your for your enthusiasm and support for the book. It's so really appreciated, and it's really important that we have the support as academics, as practitioners, as people with experience to be able to create these books, share this knowledge, disseminate this knowledge in a wider context. So in view of that, we'll be holding a lot more webinars in the future that are actually taken from the book. The book, Parveen and I categorise the different practices into 9 categories, and we're going to have more themed webinars with guest speakers. So the value of having our 4 brilliant presenters here was to show the breadth and diversity of gender-based violence in all its different contexts. And I think we've achieved that today, which is wonderful. And I thank all 4 of you for presenting and summing up your chapters. Asking you to do so in 10 minutes is really difficult because there's so much complexity with each. But also, as Sally's just said, there's so many overlaps, which is really fascinating too. So thank you, and thank you for your chapters. And I can see that we've got other chapter authors on the call as well. Moni's here, who wrote Child Abuse. So Moni will be getting in touch with you in the future to do a child abuse focused session. So please do look out for that, and we'll be distributing information on our Chiva website. So thank you for coming today. Thank you again to John and the presenters. It's been really useful just to take a little bit of time out and reflect back on the book today as well, because it was published at the start of summer and I've just returned from a month off. So to revisit the book and see what fantastic knowledge is in there has been really kind of enthusing for me. So thanks for everybody for coming, and do look out for the future webinars.
That's great, Michaela, and thank you to you and Parveen for sort of taking the leadership around this issue and putting together such a fantastic book of contributors on such an important topic. And thanks for everybody who's joined the webinar today, because I appreciate Friday afternoons, yeah, there's maybe other competition for your time, so it's really grateful that you've shown the interest to be here today. And thanks again for the contributors who spoke today and those who weren't speaking today but will speak in the future. So thank you very much, everyone, and all the very best.
Thank you. Bye.